And before Robert introduces Ellen, I just wanted to say I'm going to pass around this list to which you can add your email, and shortly we'll have a working listserv. So you can be on that and you can find out about all the exciting things we do. And I'm also going to distribute a handful of flyers for the workshop that Renda Eckert, a librettist, musician, performer, director, who's there in the back.
Hiding in the back over there.
The husband of Ellen. We'll be giving tomorrow from 1 to 5. It's open to everyone. You can come and watch, come and participate. So please think about it. So start these from either end. Here.
Welcome. Hi, I'm Robert, for those of you who don't know me. For those who do, it's so great to see a lot of familiar faces and ones that I don't recognize. So thanks so much for coming. This is a joint event that's sponsored by the Center for American Studies, which is housed in this building, and the Women and Gender Studies Initiative at AAB. My colleague Kath is here. She's very kind of co-sponsor. We work in conjunction with a lot of departments and programs here at AAB, and I'm also very happy to see friends like Lena and Sunny Abdulbaki here, who are from the theater people I admire, whom I've worked with from far beyond the walls of AAB. So we try to connect in every way that we can here at the university and beyond. Today's guest is a really extraordinary artist, and as Vanessa said, we have the privilege of having her in conjunction with Renda Eckert tomorrow at this workshop. I can't emphasize enough how much, for those of you who want to know how art's made, how theater is made, how performance comes into being, this is a very rare opportunity from 1 to 5 tomorrow afternoon at Auditorium B in West Hall. This afternoon's speaker is Ellen McLaughlin, who's worked extensively in regional and international and New York theater, both as an actor and as a playwright. Her acting work includes originating the part of the angel in Angels in America, playing the role in workshops and regional productions through its original Broadway run. Other favorite works include The Homebody in Bart Scher's production of Homebody Kabul, which is by Tony Kushner also, Pirate Jenny and Threepenny Opera, which was at Trinity Rep and elsewhere, Claire and All These A Delicate Balance, which I had the great pleasure of seeing, which was at Arena Stage in Washington at Yale Rep, Margie in Good People, and Nancy in Seascape, which is another play by Edward Albee. Her own plays have been produced off-Broadway, regionally and internationally. She's the recipient of the Writers' Award from the Lilla Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, as well as other honors, including the Susan Smith Blackburn Prize, the Helen Merrill Award for Playwriting, and grants from the NEA. Her own plays include Tongue of a Bird, Iphigenia and Other Daughters, Trojan Women, Infinity's House, Helen, Oedipus, The Persians, Penelope, Ajax in Iraq, Pericles, Septimus, and Clarissa, and the Oresteia. Producers include the Public Theater in New York, National Actors Theater, Classic Stage Company, New York Theater Workshop, the Guthrie, which is in Minneapolis, the Mark Intiman, the Mark Taper Forum in LA, the Actors Theater of Louisville, on and on and on. She's taught in several programs, including Yale School of Drama, Princeton, and the Breadloaf School of English, and she has taught and still does teach playwriting at Barnard College in New York. We're enormously honored to have her to talk about Troublesome Women, Feminist Vision, and Greek Drama. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Robert.
Welcome.
Thanks. Thanks for coming. Why do I keep being drawn back to the ancient Greek plays? On the face of it, this is an idiotic question. They are majestic, indisputably great plays. And even if they weren't, every playwright has to reckon with the Greeks, whether we want to or not, because they came up with the medium. Even if you've never read or seen one of these plays, even if you don't think you're dealing with the Greeks, if you are a playwright, you are. And of course, they are great. I take huge liberties with them, but the structure will always do its work, and the plays will have their effect. The dramaturgy is impeccable. People come in when they should, they die when they should, the climaxes hold, the truths jolt freshly every time. The mysteries last to perplex and defy us still. Even now, in this cynical and complacent age, we can't dismiss or quiet these voices from the beginnings of our consciousness. They rise up to meet us wherever we stand. So, yeah. They're momentous and important and all, but not every playwright has done what I've been doing all these years, which is to keep heading back up that hill to the temple to do yet another variation on one of these ancient stories. I keep thinking, junkie that I am, okay, that's it, I'm done, I won't be doing any more of these, and then, well, I suddenly find myself thinking about one of these plays, and then I'm reading it again just to refresh my memory, or pin down a phrase, and then, oh dear, the grandeur of the ideas and the power of the work is surging through my veins again, and I'm stepping back into that enormous, light-filled, dangerous room once more, facing the tall and terrible truths that can be found there. I've often said that the reason I like playing with the Greeks is that I can't hurt them. There is nothing I can do to these texts, no desecration I can commit that will even nick them. They will be done as long as we do any plays at all. They will endure long past whatever feckless or misguided things I do to them in my study of a Wednesday afternoon. It gives me courage to know that I can do no lasting harm. They will be fine. And that bravery to go ahead and make the necessary mistakes is welcome for a writer as filled with self-doubt as I often am. They also inspire me to take on the hardest things, what awes me, what agonizes, whatever I am most afraid of. And they encourage me to take those things on with all the ambition of writers who knew that they were responsible for articulating the fundamental values and questions at the heart of the brand new notion of civilization they helped invent. Because of course the Greeks came up with two great creations, theater and democracy, and they did it at about the same time, in the same city, and with the same hammer and nails. Theater seems to have come first, but not by all that much. Because when the city of Athens brought forth these local creations, she essentially gave birth to them as twins. Coincidence? Probably not, as anyone who has ever worked in theater can attest. Theater, like democracy, by definition, can only be done in collaboration. But both must be responsive to the needs of the moment, and they happen in the present tense. Both are done on the breath, in public. Both are dependent on speech and the mysterious human grace of empathy. They must happen right now, in front of us, and we all share the same air. And these plays by veterans performed for an audience largely composed of veterans, written with pith and hard-earned wisdom about what war is and what it costs, have given me a way to address the wars of my own time. I don't think there is any literature as clear-eyed about war. The lack of sentimentality is bracing. Both the draw of battle and its ugliness are addressed head-on. So in Trojan Women, which I wrote initially to be performed by refugees from the Bosnian War in 1995, I could take on the heartbreaking aftermath of war in such a way that people from all sides of the conflict, taking a single part and performing in collaboration with each other, and people from all sides of the conflict could perform the roles, often with multiple actors from different sides of the conflict taking a single part. And that everybody on stage felt that she owned the play that was speaking through her. These plays and their stories are so old that they belong to all of us. They belong to civilization, which means that no one can claim them as theirs alone. And no one is exempt from their harsh beauty. And that made them mightily handy when I was faced with people raw from the ravages of their civil war who were looking for some way to address that pain and who needed to work with people they would ordinarily have crossed the street to avoid. They were brought together under the shelter of that ancient text, and it gave them all voice. There is no other literature that would have done anything close to that. But the stories of the Trojan War, which make up the basis of that play and so many others, don't only inspire great plays about the misery of victims of war, they're also quite eloquent about the mortal and mortal dangers and moral dangers for the victors. The Greeks, who are the apparent winners of that conflict, fared quite badly in play after play. The primary examples are plays about the House of Atreus, where Agamemnon, the great general of the Greek troops, returns home triumphantly after 10 years' battle, only to be dispatched within hours to a brutal death by his embittered wife Clytemnestra in retribution for his murder before the war of their eldest daughter Iphigenia. All of the three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, wrote their own versions of that story, which is a devastating critique of the myth of the conquering hero. If that's what victory looks like, these playwrights insist, surely the whole cult of war and its uses needs to be questioned. Paul Fussell, the great literary critic, wrote, "Every war is ironic because all wars are worse than expected." In his book called The Great War in Modern Memory, he maintained that because the First World War was such an appalling and grotesque war for the soldiers who fought it, there was no going back afterward to any comforting notions of the glory of battle, no way of denying the horror again. And hence modernity woke up and slouched toward Bethlehem, and we've been living in that awful world ever since. But I think the Greeks already knew something about that all the way back to Homer. When Odysseus visits the underworld, he sees Achilles there and remarks that it must be quite something to be the most valorous and celebrated of all the heroic dead from the Trojan War. Achilles famously replies that he would rather live above ground as the slave of a poor master than rule for eternity as the king of the dead. It's about as stark a statement as one is likely to come across in any literature. That image of the illustrious hero rattling his medals in the gray fog of the netherworld, wishing he could trade all of that glory for even a miserable life in the sunlight above. So yes, the Greeks teach me much about war and allow me the means and the language to write about it. But when I contemplate my long engagement with the Greeks and try to understand it, I have to conclude that it's about the women I meet in these texts. It must be because I can find no female characters anywhere else so thorny with challenge and complexity, even all these thousands of years later. They blink awake inside me to unsettle and provoke. As a feminist, there isn't one among them I can encounter without misgivings. They may be brave creatures, absolute in their convictions and eloquent, every one, but Electra is stunted with bitterness, completely identified with the male and unpleasant. Antigone is obsessed with a traitorous brother she barely knew, death-loving and incapable of entertaining any point of view other than her own. Clytemnestra is a murderer, unrepentant, utterly ruthless. Chrysothemis is a passive good girl, and Medea, well, she kills her kids. So what is it about them that the writers of these plays were men who were members of an unabashedly patriarchal society where women have only marginally higher status than the slaves we should never forget that those enlightened fellows owned? The women of Golden Age Athens lived lives entirely relegated to the personal and private sphere, house, children, and nothing else. But at the center of nearly every one of these plays are female characters so startlingly vital, they provide the beating heart and articulate soul of every story. Though the actual women of the ancient world were silenced and shut from view, barely present in the public sphere, in so many of these plays it is the female presence that animates the ideas and speaks the compelling, unmistakable truth that can't be ignored. I think of Clytemnestra, who murders her husband, not because a god told her to, which is the justification both her husband and her son will use for the murders they commit, but because she decides that that's what her husband deserves for killing their daughter. It's a staggering act of defiant independence. In the beginning of the first play of the Oresteia, while the chorus of old men wait for their king Agamemnon to come home from the war and take charge again of their country, they talk warily about their queen, impressed, if uneasily, by the way she thinks like a man. But in fact, she doesn't. She thinks like herself, and for herself. She makes up her mind how justice should be done, and knowing she can't wait for some god to see it her way, she goes ahead and does it herself. After Agamemnon sacrifices their daughter in order to placate Artemis and get his fleet to Troy, Clytemnestra spends the 10 years he's gone at war planning her husband's murder and then executes it on his return without a hitch, enticing her husband out of his chariot into the house and then into a bath where she throws a net over him and summarily stabs him to death when he is helpless against her. It takes mere minutes. She completely dominates not only the first play in which she's the murderer, but the second play in which she's murdered after her son Orestes, under orders from Apollo, comes home from his exile to avenge his father. But even dead, she isn't done with us. Since Aeschylus apparently misses her furnace of individuality so much, he resurrects her to stalk the stage in the last play of the trilogy as a ghost, yelling at the Furies to wake up and take vengeance against the son who murdered her. She's terrifying and original, easily the most dynamic figure in the trilogy, if not in all of Greek literature. Because she shows up in so many of the plays, I've had a chance to write versions of her in several of my own. First in an adaptation of Euripides' play Iphigenia in Aulis, and then in Sophocles' play Electra, and most recently in a version of Aeschylus' trilogy, the Oresteia. She always livens up the proceedings and adds a level of menace and shock that is unique, even to Greek tragedy, which is no stranger to blood and the chaos it breeds. Women in these plays, though so often powerless, are oddly free of the constraints the male characters are subject to. Their persons, but not their personalities, are bound by a system from which they are excluded, so they have to make up their own sense of things and act accordingly. They are creatures of personal whim and homemade, concocted morality. Even Antigone's apparent piety seems eccentric and overwrought to the chorus, who watch her queasily and can't quite manage to sympathize with her. She makes everyone uncomfortable because her sense of justice is so much her own peculiar creation. As women, these characters don't have either political or physical power, so they must devise alternatives out of whatever comes to hand, which is the personal, the private, the domestic. Clytemnestra lures her husband into the only place she has complete authority, the house, and kills him there using, I can only imagine, the same kitchen knife she might use to cut a chicken's neck. How can these women subjugate men when the men control all sources of power and can physically overwhelm them so easily? Through guile, as with Clytemnestra's masterful powers of persuasion, but often their most powerful weapon is the ultimate last recourse, which is self-destruction. The plays are littered with female suicides, usually by hanging, and always in private, often when the certainty of their tragedy dawns on the wives before it dawns on their husbands. Oedipus's wife Jocasta and Creon's wife Eurydice do the one thing they can do for themselves in response to the unendurable truths they realize. They at least have the authority over their own bodies to decide when to make a final exit. But even when these women choose to take charge of their lives rather than relinquish them, their actions so often can't help but be self-destructive. After all, when Clytemnestra kills her husband, she seals her doom since she knows her son will in turn have to take revenge on her. And when Antigone defies Creon, she knows that she is committing an elaborate form of suicide since he will have to execute her for treason. Cassandra's awful power of prophecy is last used to helplessly predict her own death. And Electra, in being her mother's tormentor and her household scourge, makes her own life miserable as well. But what can they do? Female weapons are so limited and so paltry. Medea, enraged when her husband Jason casts her aside like trash so he can marry his expedient next wife, takes the only power she has to hurt him and does the unthinkable, kills their children. It's such an appalling action, but it makes terrible sense. She has nothing else to use against him other than the children she has made and who are in her care. Even Lysistrata's genius as an anti-war activist is a kind of inverse of Medea's logic when she realizes that the one thing women have as a leverage against the men of Greece is that men are dependent on them for sex. And when women refuse sex, they're not only denying their husbands simple pleasure, they're also refusing to bring forth any more sons to be sacrificed to their father's useless wars. But here I think about three very different female characters I've spent time with. Penelope, Iphigenia, and Helen, who bear more relationship to each other than to any of these other girls. My difficulties with all of them have interested me so much that I went to the length of dedicating entire plays to each of them in the attempt to understand them. On the face of it, they share a kind of stoic passivity. Penelope is patience embodied. Iphigenia is the sacrificial lamb, helpless to effect her fate. And Helen, well, she might as well be a statue hauled from one place to another for all she actually ever does. But to talk about action only misses the point with such characters, because what is interesting about these women is what goes on in their heads. And I've come to understand them as three distinct minds at work, intellectuals, in fact, making sense of their uniquely perplexing situations and working out what they can do in response, if anything. For each of them, the primary action on stage is thinking, which I have to say is just about my favorite thing to watch. There is nothing quite as compelling for me in the theater as watching a great actor trying to figure something out. And so in my version of Iphigenia and Aulus, that's pretty much what we do as an audience. We watch two characters separately thinking something through. This is the play in which Iphigenia is brought by her mother Clytemnestra to Aulus, where her father, General Agamemnon, presides over his landlocked Greek fleet on the windless shore, unable to sail to Troy because, according to a soothsayer, the goddess Artemis is offended. She has demanded a sacrifice, and not just any sacrifice, the sacrifice of a child, one particular child, the daughter of Agamemnon. So Agamemnon lures his wife and daughter to Aulus, saying that the great Achilles wants to marry Iphigenia before the fleet heads off. Mother and daughter arrive, but once there, everything seems wrong somehow. I set the play in their two speaking streams of consciousness as a duo of monologues. The increasingly angry and affronted Clytemnestra circles the quiet, growing perplexity and fear of Iphigenia, who sits still at the center of the stage, trying to understand what's going on. She is a princess, which ought to mean something, but what it really amounts to here, she is finding, is that no one will tell her the truth, and she's left alone to figure out what the heck is happening. It's a gradual realization, and the climax of the play is the final moment of both relief and horror when all comes clear. Here's a passage from the end of the play. Iphigenia says, "Father stood in the tent for a while yesterday. He looks ill and won't meet my eyes. He won't touch me. Who is this husband? What is this marriage? Tonight the ritual knives are being sharpened on stone. Tonight there are figures circling the fire, all in black, telling hymns I don't know. What kind of marriage are we preparing? I thought I would wear flowers, but nothing grows here. I thought there would be women. There are no women. Are there no other girls in the world? Suddenly I am the last and only girl. And all these turning faces, all these anxious, idle fingers, all these men to satisfy. This is the bride, the only bride. Morning comes and I am a white dress, walking up the crumbling cliff as if I know where I'm going, what I'm doing. Visible me. This is a terrible place. Something must be done. Ah, I see. I was right. Here is my husband, this ancient stone, and the quick shadow of the knife. I am to marry everyone, every single one. This is what it is, at last. Blackout, sound of wind, and that's the end of that. A character who, though she can do nothing to change her fate, still insists on understanding it. And any character who can view her own death with irony is someone I admire. The last play of my trilogy, which is called Iphigenia and Other Daughters, is based on Euripides' Iphigenia in Taurus. In it, Iphigenia, though she was sacrificed in the first play, was by a strange mercy of the gods saved and whisked away to the remote fastness of the island of Taurus, where she lives out an odd fate as a priestess of Artemis who rescued her, surrounded by other bemused young women who share a similar background privilege. They are enjoined to kill any man who comes to the island and sacrifice him to the goddess. So, of course, her brother Orestes washes up there, maddened by the Furies who are still punishing him for killing their mother, Clytemnestra. Their mother being Iphigenia and Orestes. He has been told by Apollo that if he steals the statue of the goddess and takes it back to Athens, he will be released from the torment. The siblings recognize each other, and in the Euripides version of the play, they conspire to steal the statue and ultimately escape the island together, bringing the cycle of their family's violence to an end at last. In my play, there is no statue per se, and the two siblings try to work out if they can possibly be able, between them, to come up with some solution to the seemingly unendable, grinding business of their family's blood debts. They trade the knife back and forth, each offering to be killed by the other, but they realize that that will only crank the wheel of retribution one more time. Finally, Iphigenia makes a peculiar sacrifice of herself and says, I am the statue you have come to find. Take me to the city, to the center of the city. Build noise and life around me. I will be silent and tall. I will remind them. I will seem to see everything. I will be female and slightly terrifying. I will be what I have always been, visible and mute. You will place me at the center of something, and you will lay your tortured head upon my cold feet, and you will finally sleep. This is how the legend performs itself to an end. Orestes says, I can do this for you. Iphigenia says, I can do this for you. Orestes says, and this will be the part everyone will forget. Iphigenia says, the needle through the wall of history. Orestes says, the part of justice which is merely, Iphigenia, personal. Orestes, inelegant. Iphigenia, a quirk. Orestes, a sliver of light. Iphigenia, that is only. Orestes, and finally, Iphigenia, something like Orestes. Love. In the course of that exchange, Iphigenia has gradually struck a pose like that of a statue, resolving herself into a radical stillness. Her eyes go dead and her limbs harden such that by the last line, Orestes feels himself to be alone. Orestes looks up at his translated sister. He has been left holding the knife. He places it before him. Silence. He curls up on the ground, laying his head upon her feet. He closes his eyes. End of play. I became fascinated similarly with the character of Helen and by what might have been going on in the mind of a character who can't do much about the way that the world makes use of her, but who can think in complex ways about the strangeness of what she is. Euripides' unique and truly weird play, which is called Helen, concerns a bizarre minor deviation from the conventional narrative of her myth in which Helen never goes to Troy at all, but is spirited away to Egypt, of all places, while a cloud copy of her, fashioned by the gods, goes to Troy in her place. In the Euripides play, Helen spends the length of the Trojan War under the somewhat dubious protection of the royal court of Egypt. I set mine in the isolated privilege of a fancy Egyptian hotel room where my Helen waits in increasing impatience for Menelaus to finally get a clue and come find her. She's frustrated because she can never get any news of the war she knows is being fought in her name. She can't seem to get cable on her television and is confined to watching local soap operas, cooking shows, and weather reports. Until the day the play takes place, her only company has been the somewhat cryptic female servant who attends her and who, when Helen asks her to tell her stories to pass the time, always tells her versions of Helen's own. It's maddening. Occasionally they talk about the phenomenon of what they've come to call the Helen. The entity Helen, to some extent, inhabits, but which also has very little to do with her. The Helen is what they spend their days maintaining, constantly tending that face, that body, that perfection that has imprisoned and defined Helen for as long as she can remember. Their conversations always circle back around to the nature of beauty, which Helen has spent her life puzzling over, being both the beneficiary and the victim of it. So this is an exchange from early in the play between Helen and the servant. Helen says, I didn't worry about the world. This splitting of image from being never bodes well. The first knockoff only begs for another. Copy spews forth copy, an infinite proliferation like a nuclear reaction. Each replication spawning yet another generation of duplicates until she moves like a virus through the city, facing you at every turn. Her name spelled out in the night sky, her pictures blown like debris to be tread underfoot and washed into gutters. She's everywhere. The servant says, it's hard to believe there ever was an actual Helen, just some woman with breasts that swell or sag, hair that grows, menstrual cycle. Helen says, thoughts, thoughts. She has an interior life. She's not just a body. The servant says, someone who belongs to herself and not to the world. See, there's the image of Helen, and that does not belong to her. It's ours. She's part of us, like our dreams, that Helen. Something we see on the back of our closed eyelids when someone says, for instance, the most beautiful woman in the world. We possess, it turns out, so much of her. Images of her crying at state funerals, sleek in black, the mist of a veil only adding to her beauty. Or we see her sitting on some podium looking attentively at the back of her husband's head as he stands there pontificating, unheard. He knows she's there, blazing behind him. He knows no one's looking at him except her, of course, and that's enough. We have tracked the nature of our times on her body. Eras of greed are displayed for us in her cycles of embarrassing weight gain, her mortifying battle with her demons. We pored over the least flattering shots, those furtive, ungainly escapes into limousines, her skirt rucked up over her thick haunches, Or there were the times she starved herself like a saint for us, when her dresses hung limp on her and her eyes sunk like bright stones in her bony face. Then we clucked our disapproval and shook our heads, feeling something we couldn't name. Was it pity? No. No, just revulsion. Really, I mean, look at her. She never knew when to stop. Thank goodness. Because still we hungered for her, image after image. We couldn't get enough. We made her sleep with the lights on, her window shades up so that we could press our noses against the window pane and watch her dreams slide over her face. Helen shudders and says, I'll tell you the one I hated the most. The simpering, vulnerable one with skin like sponge sugar, so soft and sweet your jaws ached when you looked at her. Those wet eyes, that high, breathy voice, the head always cocked to one side like a not too bright cocker spaniel who has been told everything twice. But there was only one role in an infinite repertoire. She was spectacularly accommodating. The servant says she was a child and yet a whore. Helen says an angel and yet a goddess of sex. The servant says she slices, she dices. Helen says she walks, she talks, she's remarkable. The servant says she was remarkable. How did she do all those things at once? Helen says, oh, I don't know. Sometimes I think it's impossible to pull it off, embody all those contradictions and still be so vacant. No wonder she disappeared. How could anyone keep it up? You just get worn out, sick to death of trying to slot into everybody's personal fantasies, having to be so visible all the time. She never had a minute to herself. It was consuming her. It was terrible. That's enough. She pulls her hands away from them being buffed. My cuticles are throbbing. Leave me alone. The servant exits, taking a clothes rack with her. Helen says to the gods, my God, I can't stand it anymore. I need some information. Something to live on. It's like swallowing dust for 17 years. If I don't get to go to Troy, could you at least send someone over here who can tell me about it? Suddenly, amidst great fanfare, Athena enters in complete regalia, looking pissy. And then there's Penelope. I've always loved the Odyssey. Always felt far more at home inside it than I ever could inside the Iliad. But it wasn't until I ran across an odd strain of scholarship that I began to understand why. I stumbled on an essay by Robert Graves, which was corroborated by no less an expert than Joseph Campbell, to the effect that Homer's Odyssey might in fact have been written by a woman, or have arisen from a female bardic tradition which may have existed at the same time as the male bardic tradition. The reasoning is that one compelling way the book can be read is as a series of metaphors for the arduous spiritual and psychological journey a soldier has to take in order to leave the battlefield behind him and finally return home. It is the necessary passage of the veteran's soul from one test to the next that finally allows him to walk back through his own front door and re-enter civilization. It is a long process because he needs to learn something at each turn in the winding road. And in the Odyssey, as it happens, at every juncture, what he needs to learn, he learns from a female. Whether from demigoddesses like Circe and Calypso, his patron goddess Athena, or Penelope, the mortal wife he finally comes home to after 20 years on the road. He's constantly finding himself in positions when his very survival depends on the mercy of a female. Sometimes it's luck or his charm, and sometimes it's just the pity of a female that saves him. One of the most telling clues to the author of the story, according to Graves, is at the heart of the book. When Odysseus, his fleet, and all his comrades, long lost, barely survives his raft's shipwreck and washes up on an unknown shore and passes out there. He possesses nothing at this point other than his life. He wakes to see a group of girls led by the local princess, whose name is Nausicaa, playing together after doing laundry and laying it out to dry. Naked and filthy, he nevertheless manages to impress the level-headed princess so much that she lends him royal clothing and then leads him back to her palace, which is described in detail, where she tells him he must present himself, and this is important, to her mother and ask to be taken in. Well, there are several significant clues here, in fact. The first is that in the midst of this great adventure story, the author takes the trouble to explain how laundry is done. Seems odd, since no self-respecting man of the ancient world would ever have known about such things, or at any rate care enough to insert such information at the center of a rollicking epic. Then there is the meticulous and loving description of the palace and its gardens, which is, however grand, the domestic sphere. But perhaps the most telling is the fact that Odysseus is told twice, first by Nausicaa, and then again by Athena, disguised as a girl, that it's the queen the stranger must present himself to, not the king, if he is to be accepted into the court. And Odysseus is no fool. He takes their advice to heart and immediately embraces the knees of the girl's mother and charms her with this respectful modesty. Graves' theory was that the book was written by the Nausicaa herself, who, as the worldly princess of a rich seafaring nation, would have heard many great maritime stories at the royal table when merchants and dignitaries blew through. She would have been highly educated and perhaps had enough time on her hands to write. But she would also have known how to do laundry and might have thought that the details involved were worthy of a few verses in the midst of the story. It's a rather marvelous notion, I've always thought. In any case, this is all to say that whoever wrote the Odyssey, in writing Penelope, the writer created an enigmatic and canny woman who is worth the long journey home. Once again, we have a female character who uses the only means she has available to her to shape her fate. Besieged for years by dozens of suitors, she has to invent the most famous stalling tactic of all time, using the only legitimate occupation for any woman, weaving, to postpone a decision. She tells them that she will have to finish the tapestry she's working on before she can make a commitment of any kind. It's the only acceptable excuse she could ever have come up with, and it gulls the boys for years as she unravels her work night after night. Again, we have a character who is trapped, unable even to respectably leave her room and move freely in her own house as she waits for the action of the novel in the shape of her errant husband to finally return to her. What does she do while she waits? Yes, she weaves and unravels the same tapestry, but as she does, she lives in the privacy of her own thoughts, and I can't help wondering what they must be. So I wrote a one-woman theater piece called Penelope that I have performed with a string quartet. It tells a modern version of the story of a woman whose life is suddenly interrupted when her long-estranged ex-husband, who was a compulsive and charming liar, appears at her door out of the blue, now a traumatized amnesiac veteran. So my Penelope says, I knew he'd gone to war, but the divorce was over 20 years ago now. We'd lost touch, and frankly, I'd forgotten about him. There have been so many men in my life since then. The summer he returned to me in particular, there were so many men milling around that it was chaos and totally exhilarating. I never lied to them. It was a point of principle with me after all the lies he'd told me. They all knew about each other. Sometimes 3 or more would end up sharing the table at dinner, bumping hips with each other in the kitchen when warming the bread or tossing the salad, and then eyeing each other as they passed the new potatoes. Then we'd all drink too much and make sozzled ice cream runs in the cool of the evening. Usually, we'd all end up lying in the meadow, dizzily trying to make out the constellations. The summer took its time. Lovers came and went. I made bird houses, dozens of them, for the swallows, there's so many, and they flew in and out of them. like lines of thread passing through a loom. But then he came. And all of that ended. I still go out sometimes to the meadow at night and look up. Orion, the hunter, is the only one I've ever been sure of him. Him with his jeweled scabbard and his sketchy guess of a figure. He reminds me of Odysseus. Yeah, that's what I've started calling him. You'll see why. And of course you can call me Penelope. Why not? He doesn't know who I am, and I don't know who he's become. Oh, it had nothing to do with me. It was the house he came back to. There wasn't a trace of recognition when he looked at me, or even the sense that he ought to know who I was. He barely glanced at me anyway. I wasn't the point. He just made a beeline for that chair he used to like and sank into it. He looked like a starved, wounded animal who's finally found sanctuary. It was clear even then that this was it. This was the last place. He had nowhere else on earth left to go. So that's when he began his vigil in his armchair, looking out to sea. I sit with him sometimes and watch the horizon with him. I think we're waiting for him to arrive. Both of us. We're waiting for him to come home. Days, weeks, months pass as we wait. And there's nothing passive about it. It's quite an active business, this vigil. He sits there in that armchair day in, day out. I'd say he sleeps in it, except I've almost never seen him do that. I come downstairs in the middle of the night, and there he is, staring. It's like having a pot forever on the boil, always simmering away in the house. It's hard to leave the place sometimes. The sense that the house is going to blow. So this is what I'm doing. I'm reading aloud. I'm reading him the Odyssey. I used to know some Greek, now that's all gone, but I can recall the scent of it, that language underneath the translation. So it goes slowly, the reading, because of this, as if I were making it up as I went along. And it's true, I take liberties. Well, I do make it up. I make it mine. I make it his. I've made it our story. So in the play, he doesn't recover his memory, but in the course of reading the book to him, she begins to intuit these parallel incidents her ex-husband experienced in war and on his journey home from the battlefield that triggered the trauma and the memory loss that have damaged him so profoundly. Reading the Odyssey to the stranger she once knew and loved awakens a kind of radical empathy in her, and she comes to understand him. Late in the play, as they get to the end of the book, she says, so Odysseus returns to Ithaca at last, but comes in disguise as a beggar to his raucous hall, now the feasting ground of all the young men who, insatiable for roasted meat, slaughter Odysseus' herds and swill all his best booze. But you really can't blame them. They don't know any better. These are the boys left behind by the fathers Odysseus took with him to Troy and didn't bring home. Not a single one. He eyes the young men with murderous contempt. These too will have to die before his voracious narrative can be satisfied, which will make it 2 generations of his island's men, all his male subjects, hundreds of his own people. That's how many deaths it takes to bring this warrior home. All this talk about roasted meat, which seems to be the only fare in the ancient world, makes me do something uncharacteristic. I run out and buy steaks for dinner. I get nice cuts of meat and grill them on the barbecue. First time I've used it since the summer. That seems like a whole other lifetime. The long, warm days, the house milling with all those men, opening wine bottles, checking out the record collection. I flip the steaks and bounce on my heels, trying to stay warm in the chill air, looking out at the naked trees, thinking about how quiet my days and nights have become. We don't conduct our lives in complete silence. That would be unbearable. We do talk, usually about the house, the weather, the immediate and tiny concerns of the day-to-day. But it's a poor substitute for that ineffable thing, conversation, something the man I once married excelled at. Turns out that was one of his many gifts. The steaks turn out nicely, if I do say so, and in celebration, I decide to set the long table instead of feeding him in his chair, as usual. He doesn't seem fazed when I invite him to the table and give him a glass of wine. About halfway through the meal, an odd thing occurs. I notice him picking up a scrap of meat from his plate and holding it under the table. It's a little gesture, and I probably wouldn't have noticed it, except I used to be on the lookout for it 20 years ago, when we had Alice, the sweet spaniel he used to feed surreptitiously under the table, much to my irritation, since I thought it encouraged her to beg. I just go ahead and say, "What are you doing?" He says, "What?" And oh my God, I know that face, that composed, bland face, so very different from the one he's presented to me all this time, because this time he's dissembling. It's a constructed face. He's lying. It's not that unbearable, empty plate of a face I've found it so hard to look at all this time. No, this is pretended innocence. Something like jubilation floods through me. I say, "The meat you're holding under the table, who's that for?" And then there's that other long-lost look, the sly, rueful concession of a man who's been found out. He actually smiles as he pops the meat into his mouth. Then he says, "Well, where is she?" "Who?" There's just a flicker of doubt before he says, "Alice." And then, slowly, carefully, I tell him the story of Alice, our dear old dog whose heart he broke when he left us all those years ago, because she was fond of me, but she adored him. She waited for him in all weathers, lying at the front door, looking down the road, a furrow appearing in her speckled face. It was a furrow I would stroke, trying to smooth it, erase that unending confusion, but it only deepened with the years as her face went white, until there was a morning in the early spring, just as it was getting warm, when she finally chose to forego continuing her vigil for the man who never returned. He didn't say a word through all of this, the saga of Alice, until he asked if I'd buried her. And in fact, I had her ashes right out in the back under the plum tree. I'd even carved her name into a round stone from the beach. We went out there and stood in the spill of light from the house and looked at it. And then we wept. It took a long time. And then we came in and sat at the table and began to speak. It's a bloodbath, the end of the suitors, and then the peculiarly horrid hanging of the hapless serving girls, the suitors raped or cajoled or simply enjoyed, the way they enjoyed the household goods of the absent owner over all those long years of lolling about. The girls are strung up on a sort of pulley system, cleverly devised for efficiency, and they ride and then hang limp in awful maidenly consort. And there they are, throttled no more ceremonially than one might crank the heads off a bunch of birds. They dangle whitely, swaying together, their hard hands chopped from their work hang in bunches, red as chicken feet. Then there's the moment the book was built to elucidate that the reunion between man and wife, a night of sex and stories, the night Athena, hardly a romantic, nevertheless goes so far as to make longer for them by stalling the dawn. Odysseus goes off the next morning to see his wretched father, cruelly and unaccountably toying with the old man by dissembling one last time before revealing himself. The guy spends half the damn book in disguise or nameless. I guess it's a habit it's hard to break. And then the families of killed suitors attempt to avenge those deaths. Yet another melee ensues before divinity intervenes and breaks the whole thing up, sending everyone home to their empty houses and the new regime. Except that's not where it ends. Well, that's where the book ends, but not the story. Because the story isn't done with Odysseus yet. We know he has yet one more Odyssey to make, the last one, and it's the one he must make alone. It's a prophecy he heard in the land of the dead, something he must do to bring his long story to an end. He must carry an oar far inland, so far inland that no one knows what the thing he carries is because they've never heard of the sea. And if they've never heard of the sea, perhaps that means he will finally be in a place where no one's ever heard of him. And for the first time, he will no longer need to dissemble. He will at last be a stranger. He will have arrived at the place where he can finally make sacrifice and atone for all he did. And there he will plant his oar and weep. So that's the end of the excerpt from Penelope. I've spent much of my life trying to understand men. I have watched carefully. I've watched carefully and listened hard. I have empathized as if my life depended on it, but then of course it has. There was the Athenian, it was nearly the entirety of my education, learning men. I grew up reading literature almost exclusively by and about men and was trained to extrapolate all human experience from those narratives. Perhaps that's why these female characters who can do so little except stand at the sidelines of history, even when, as with Helen, it is their own history they must passively witness, seem so real to me. Their silence is eloquent. The look in their eyes as they think their unexpressed thoughts is familiar. And when in spasms they attempt to wrest control of their fates away from men, I feel for them even when they are monstrous. They are what I am in my darkest imaginings. So when they snatch at power, no matter how paltry, no matter how fleeting, I can't help but feel that reaching spirit in me. There is a reason men have been so terrified of women over the millennia. They know, they must, what suppression does to the human psyche. Human history has been a long fuse, and they suspect they are sitting at the end of it. What might that pent force do once it is finally unleashed? What would it say if ungagged? We get a sense of it from these plays, which give voice to the female, that ancient voice we know if we listen hard. They are among us, this uneasy sorority of Greek female characters. They seem utterly alien and remote, standing at the distance of human history from us, at the same time that they seem to me as real and immediate as last night's nightmare or today's pang of yearning. Which brings me to my latest engagement with the Greeks, which has been a new version of the Oresteia I've been writing for Shakespeare Theatre in DC, where we go into rehearsal a few days after I return from here. For those of you who don't know the plays, they are some of the oldest we have, written by Aeschylus, and they comprise the only complete trilogy we have of the many plays that were written and performed in trilogies for the great festivals. The Oresteia tells the story of the house of Atreus, starting with Clytemnestra's murder of her husband, Agamemnon, on his return from the Trojan War. The second play moves years forward to the return of Orestes and his collusion with his sister Electra to kill their mother in retribution. The third play centers on what happens to Orestes in the aftermath of his murder of Clytemnestra, his madness and persecution by the Furies, those terrifying primordial goddesses who take vengeance on those who commit crimes against blood. They are particularly offended by matricide, since they are the champions above all for the female at the most primal level. When Athena convinces them to let Orestes' fate be decided by a trial by jury, the Furies stand as the prosecuting attorneys, while Apollo, who urged Orestes on to avenge his father's murder by killing his mother, stands as his defense counsel. Athena is the presiding judge. The trial is represented as the first in history, and the Athenian citizens who act as the jury split up and end up split evenly between those who side with the Furies in thinking that the matricide should die, and those who side with Apollo in thinking that his crime is justified. Athena, as was agreed, gets to cast the deciding vote, and she opts for mercy. The Furies are, well, furious and threaten to destroy the city of Athens until Athena persuades them to accept the decision by bargaining with them. She reasons that if they spare the city, instead of merely being feared, they will be honored and even beloved by all her citizens. A temple will be built for them beneath her own temple, and they will be extolled as the foundation of the rule of law that has just been established. When the Furies accept their new status as august rather than ferocious forces at the heart of a new world order, the final procession up to the Acropolis that ends the play brings the whole bloody cycle to an end with the establishment of order, the triumph of the sky gods, and an appeasement of the Furies that is also their subjugation. The terrifying female violence they represented is translated in something less overt, more obscure, religious, and comfortable to live with. It's a happy ending. I began writing my version in the summer of 2016 in what seems another world, and got a draft of the first two acts together fairly quickly, passing them in by late October. I was puzzling over how I might approach the third act, the one everyone agrees is the hardest because it can become a kind of tedious civics lesson at its worst, when the unthinkable happened with the election of the latest American president. I came to a dead stop and could see no way forward, not only in the play, but in my life. Then my mother died, and I can't help but blame Trump for that, as for so much else, since she was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat and a true patriot who grew up in D.C. as a child of a lawyer who worked for FDR and wrote much of the legal underpinning of the New Deal. She was devastated by the election, but had less stamina to cope with that heartache than the rest of us. I comfort myself that she hasn't had to live through the inauguration and everything that has followed. After the election, I wrote to the people at Shakespeare Theatre to say that I was in crisis about what to do with the third act. I was on the plane coming back from Seattle, where I'd been acting in a new play. I wrote, "As I look out the plane window at the supermoon tonight, that bloody giant rising slowly up the sky, I am trying to understand what is clawing away at me about the final play, my difficulty with it, particularly now. Every pass I take at it, I can't help feeling disengaged when it comes to what I think is unavoidably Aeschylus's intent, which is to justify the ascendance of the patriarchy as embodied in the sky gods over the older matriarchal goddesses who once held sway. The ending, no matter how triumphal, is still a matter of relegating the female to a non-political sphere of presiding over the spirit, matters of home and hearth, kinship and blood. They will be loved rather than feared, but what does that mean? They will be driven underground, where their vitality will be made to service the doings of the human males above, and where they can do no real harm anymore because they have lost their might in that willing compromise. As a woman, this has always struck me as deeply suspect, just as is the way that every female character who doesn't yield her power to the male is by necessity silenced or destroyed. As an American, I'm shaken to my core, but I'm feeling most devastated as a feminist. And I honestly don't know what to do about that in relationship to this play. I have seen the death of the humanist vision of the future, a skilled and dedicated woman humiliated, and the triumph against all justice and reason of the worst strain of the masculine. I have seen enough of the subjugation of the female to last a lifetime. We need to talk this through in the light of what has just happened in our country and see if there is a way we can find to do justice both to the source and to the needs of our time. The folks at the theater were entirely sympathetic, saying that they too felt disoriented and unsure on how to proceed. They mentioned that I might want to take a look at Euripides' version of the same play, written at the dead end of the golden age that Aeschylus helped to bring forth, and they're very close, and very close to the destruction of the civilization Euripides had so often rightly warned the Athenians they would lose if they strayed too far from their first best principles. His version of the play, one of the darkest and most cynical in all of theatrical literature, is a kind of high, absurdist rendering of the aftermath of Orestes' murder of Clytemnestra. It's stripped of ideals and sense. The majesty of the Aeschylean vision of the birth of the democratic order is not even a whiff in the fetid air. Orestes and Electra are rendered as mad thugs running riot. There is no justice to be had, and it all devolves into chaos and ugliness. It's terrifying, brutal stuff, and if I couldn't manage to exalt the dawn of rationality with the embrace of Aeschylus, I knew that trying to enter into the Euripidean vision would make me want to slit my wrists. I sunk back into despair until I called my friend Katrin in England, who works in human rights, primarily in Africa. We commiserated for a while about the state of things, Brexit, and Trump, and the dread we felt every morning at dawn. I finally said, this is not the first time people have felt this way. And in fact, the Oresteia is about how a people moves on after terrible trauma and inexplicable violence. We have to find a way forward. People have done this. They have recovered the best of human nature, even when they thought it had been lost forever. Let's think of times in human history when people have done the right thing. The Marshall Plan came to mind, a moment in American history when our enlightened self-interest led us to do right by a traumatized Europe after the devastation of World War II. And then she mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, without which she maintains that country would be in a state of perpetual civil war, embroiled in a bitter past they could never escape. The principle at work is that both the perpetrators and the victims of violence are exiled by those experiences from their community, and that something must be done to reinstate them in the circle of the human. She spoke about what was borne out time and again when the glorious simplicity of the concept was honored. It is not about absolution. It is not about forgiveness, though that can sometimes happen. It's simply about gathering in a public space open to all. Everyone concerned, both the victims and the perpetrators of the violence, is present. Nothing is promised, but all will be heard. Everybody gets to speak their truth. And in so doing, we, all of us, recognize each other. It is an ancient concept, a Greek one, in fact, that notion that in recognizing each other in all our confusion, pain, and jagged moments of violence and cruelty, bravery and kindness, we draw ourselves back to the circle of what we share, what gives us a stake in each other, our happiness and our enlightenment. It's born of the belief that only by bringing us all into the same place and hearing the truth, if we can speak it, can we heal. Which is, of course, the basic principle at work in theater. I thought, if I can find a way to bring that essential grace to the third act of my play, I might be able to write my way to something like hope in these dark times. So that's what I did. I wish I could have written something more in line with the optimism of Aeschylus' marvelous grand vision of the forging of democracy, but neither is mine the death knell lunacy of Euripides. Athens in her ancient glory may have fallen as he told them it would, but the scent of her lingers all these centuries hence, and the handful of plays we are still marveling at. The world has kept some of that beauty and memory of her best dreams. They survive in us, and they can serve us as we serve them in our own bad times, knowing that something of us too will last, even if the worst happens. Even so. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like you to, because of course that notion, over in America with all of our Greek temples as government buildings and all of that neoclassical stuff, we don't think about it with the same complexity and level of nuance that you're all thinking about, the basis of civilization and all like that. And it has been pointed out to me and all of us that even in America, notions of democratic governance were in fact started by the Iroquois, the Native American tribe. And Ben Franklin based some of his first principles of the Constitution and how government should be set up on the Iroquois nation. So there are a couple of seats down here if you want to come from the back. We've got 4, 5, 6 seats.
Are there other questions? Please, I could go on and on. I don't want to monopolize you.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Just wanted to ask you to say okay. So you were drawing some parallels from Greek mythology. You're saying it's very interesting that such a patriarchal society, and then there's these women in these plays who are very daring, very bold, and eloquent even in their silence. I guess my question is, as a playwright and as someone who has studied theater extensively, where else do you see such women who truly mark a certain play or a character beyond the Greek mythology that you thought also was very essential in a sense, I guess?
My experience is that it's unique to Greek plays.
Okay.
Shakespeare was often used as an example of a playwright who has strong and complicated female characters, actually doesn't use them to the extent that the Greeks do, which any actor can tell you, all of the female actors I know, is like, there are a handful of really, really great parts for women, but in Shakespeare, but then you get past a certain point, and if you haven't played those parts by the time of 27, then they're like 2. And one of them is the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. And that is not true of the Greek plays. You can get old in Greek plays. Of course, they were all played by men, in the era when they were being played. Men in masks. So there was a masked theater. But still, there's the truth that every single play, even the Persians, which has all men in it except for the queen, at the center of every single one of these plays, there's a female. It's just interesting. Yes?
Thank you. I have a question in relation to your adaptations. It seems like some of them you chose to set in the present, and some of them you keep in the kind of time of the play. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about your adaptation decisions in relation to that, and also in relation to the one that you're going back to rehearse. When you're, where is that set? How do you talk about it?
Yeah. I try to make sure that they don't land spang in any one particular era, that they are, that although Helen is talking about not being able to get cable, she also is concerned with the Trojan War, and she's wearing something that looks sort of classical, and I want there to be this sort of inability to sort of say, oh, it's being set in 1906 or 1962 or whatever. So I want to make the audience not be able to be entirely comfortable. But each one, I mean, Helen was written as a commission for a theater festival that was very loose in the way that they let me go about it. Whereas the Trojan Women was written specifically for the refugees from the Bosnian War, and I wanted to keep it fairly straight on with the play. You know, each play has needed an entirely different approach. And that's what makes them, for me, still interesting, is that I can't, there isn't the same approach to any one of them. And I like the fact that I can't ever say, oh, I know how I do this. You know, the Oresteia, I really went back and forth about how modern was the language, and some of the language is pretty modern. There are a couple of scenes between Clytemnestra and Agamemnon which sound like a married couple of today. But then you go back into the, you know, that kind of majestic quality of the Aeschylus, because you need that size and that language. And, you know, I love being able to sort of rock in and out of, you know, different means of going about it. And I think if you do it right, the audience will go along with you. I mean, sometimes I've seen them performed where the costumes are very specific to a certain era, and it's like, it never quite works.
I have a question about Ajax in Iraq,
Uh-huh.
and I kind of want to know what was going on in your head, because you're really interested by these Greek women, but we see that it isn't really from Tecmessa's point of view, it's more Athena, and then you've made a copy of Ajax in female form as AJ. So how did that happen?
Yeah, I should say that Ajax in Iraq was generated in collaboration with the graduate acting program at ART, which is a part of Harvard. So these were graduate students, and I was the playwright in residence for a year, during which time I knew that I wanted to write a play about the American experience of fighting in Iraq. And I asked the students to bring in material in theatrical form that addressed what they wanted to talk about in terms of that. In terms of that issue. And so they brought in, over the course of 6 months, about 25 hours worth of material, all of which we filmed. But 5 hours of it, I would say, was like we could have just put that on stage. It was that good. But I was not comfortable with doing that because I was going to write my name on the bottom of the script, you know. So I took all of these concerns of theirs and tried to address them. And one of their concerns was that there has never been a larger proportion of women in the military in combat capacity. So that women are in the front lines in the sense that they're oftentimes drivers. And so they are, which is the most dangerous thing to do in Iraq. And so they're getting killed at the rate that the male soldiers are getting killed. But they're not only in danger in the same way that the men are, but they are also facing, across the boards, sexual abuse, oftentimes by their commanding officers. So it's a sort of command rape situation. So they're being traumatized doubly. And it's just a level of trauma that the male soldiers are not dealing with. And they find it in case after case after case. And Ajax, if you don't know the play, it's basically, it's the one play in the Greek canon in which a soldier commits suicide, a character commits suicide on stage. That does not happen in any other play, and suicide it certainly doesn't happen. It never happens in front of the audience. But he has this incredible soliloquy, and then he kills himself. And he's also very clearly a traumatized veteran, and he's partly traumatized by being humiliated, as he understands it, by his commanding officers, Agamemnon and Menelaus, the brothers who are the generals of the Greek fleet. And he goes mad, he berserks, and he kills a bunch of sheep, thinking that it's the generals, and it's a really, really ugly and sad story, and I couldn't take it on for the longest time because I just couldn't deal with the sheep, you know. Oh God, it's a horrible image. But then I realized as all of this stuff was coming in, I didn't realize that I was going to deal with it as a Greek. I didn't know that I was going to take a Greek play, the structuring, the way to structure all of this material. But then I thought, all right, it's clearly an Ajax. And so I have two versions of Ajax. One is the more classical version of it that runs alongside the modern version of it. And at some point, these two plays meet, and it's at the moment of the suicide, where you have the female character, the modern character, and the male character, the classical character. And they're on stage, and they're facing in different directions. And she has an M16, and he has a sword, and they have a soliloquy that they speak together without ever having eye contact. So I thought that was the only way I could deal with it. And what I was trying to do was give every single one of those students, because they were extraordinary people, I wanted to do justice to what the kind of artistry that they had been bringing in, and the dedication that they had to this project, and I wanted each one of them to be happy. And then I also was really worried about the veteran community, and I kept on bringing in veterans to look at it and say, does this strike you as credible? So it was the most pressurized situation I've ever been in as a playwright, and I can't tell you how happy I was when it was over. It was like, the students were happy, the veterans were happy. I could go home. Yeah. But that's how it came to be. Yes?
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to end. But please.
Thank you. Which gender roles and characteristics do you think are better for the social order, like Greece ones, or the old ones, or the new and modern ones? Like today we have the LGBT society, for example, is a modern gender issue, and in the previous ages, like in the Greeks, we didn't have this. So which do you think?
Are you saying which do I think is more helpful for us right now, the modern versions of these things or the ancient versions of these things? As I say, I really think you have to be able to combine them so that it doesn't lie down in one way of doing it or another, because I think modern versions sometimes make these plays, which are ancient and big and bloody and disturbing, the modern versions can turn them sort of thin and shallow and glib. But if you do them as big, fat, bloody, intimidating plays, they can get sort of old and dusty and tiresome. And so what I keep on trying to do is to merge those two things so that they strike you in ways that you can't recover from too easily. But I think it has to be a combination of the two. But thank you. I guess that's...
Yeah, we're going to have one more question.
Yes,
Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for being here first. Second, I have two questions. Like, okay, so first is about Athena in Aegis in Iraq.
Yeah.
So like Athena as a character, was she, because we had this debate, was she like a narrator or a character in the play, or was she both and like it was like
I think that's a
interactive?
wonderful thing to be confused about. Because I think Athena is never confused. She comes in and is like, this is my play. And, you know, so she sort of wanders in and out. And she walks out during the funeral, the service. And she walks out during taps, which for the veterans that I brought in is like, you do not do that, you know. But she's a goddess, so she walks out. Because she's, as far as she's concerned, the end of the play that she's interested in. You know, this modern stuff. So I think I want the audience to not be sure if, is she the framing device? Is she, you know, is she actually making everything happen? Or does she just think that? And so I think that confusion is intentional. So it's the second question.
Okay, yeah. My second question is, thank you so much first. Yeah, my second question is about what, like you as a playwright was intended, like for the audience to feel while watching the play.
That's always a tricky question, isn't it? Because as I say, my major sense of obligation was to the actors that I was working with and to the veterans I was trying to do justice to. The audience sort of came like third, fourth, fifth in the set of my concern. And, you know, and I feel like trying to do justice to those dead Greek guys, you know, and not, you know, I don't want to offend them, but in terms of the audience, I can never really worry about that because they'll get it or they won't get it, they'll like it or they won't get it. I've never been able to predict that. Things that I didn't think were my best work, they go crazy about, and things that I really deeply care about and think are the best I can do, they've sometimes given me terrible reviews for, so I can't think about that. And I don't think it helps. It doesn't help me to think about it. And you know, everybody has their own way of doing it, but the audience is, you know, if I'm doing justice to the people I feel an obligation to, maybe they'll like it. But I can't, if you try to control that, it's like trying to control an end product, which is always going to screw you, in my opinion.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And again, if you like this, there's much more of a very different kind tomorrow. The workshop by Rindy Ector entitled How to Think Like an Actor Who Thinks Like a Dancer, Who Thinks Like a Writer, Who Thinks Like a Sculptor. So if you want to think in a different way, or just come and see how art is made manifest in a very beautiful process. It's 1 to 5, West Hall, Auditorium B. Come in for a little while. If you can't, you know, can only stay for 30 minutes or an hour, I'm sure you'll benefit from it. And thank you so much for coming, and thank you all.
Thank you.